Hi, guys. Welcome to the recap show. Today's movie recap will cover a 2012 crime thriller movie named Blue Eyed Butcher. Sit back, grab a drink, and enjoy. The movie begins by showing a woman, Susan Wright, putting on her makeup and preparing for a big day. Shortly afterward, Susan is accompanied into her courtroom. Susan is being tried for the murder of her husband, Jeff Wright. The prosecutor faces the judge, jury, and the people present in the courtroom. She says they are there to go over the reason Susan chose to terminate her husband instead of filing for a divorce. The movie then takes us back to 5 years earlier in order to show us what happened before Susan took the drastic decision of committing a crime that will define her life forever. Susan meets Jeff one afternoon while having a picnic on the beach. She approaches Jeff, who is busy playing a game of handball, and asks if she can join them. Jeff welcomes her and shows her the basics of the game. After the game, Susan tells Jeff about her past life and her desire to be a nurse. All these attributes make Jeff more interested in Susan. Susan lets it out that she once worked as a dancer in a nightclub, but this didn't throw Jeff off. Soon afterward, Jeff and Susan start dating, but Jeff refuses to make out with her yet. The duo started going on numerous dates together, and Jeff even made Susan happy on her 21st birthday. One night, Jeff's friend asks why Jeff hasn't touched Susan yet, and he says he wants it to be perfect. Later on, Jeff invites Susan to his apartment, and she agrees. Upon arriving there, Susan is stunned to see all the nice things Jeff has prepared for her. The duo soon gets it going and ends up doing the thingy. After they are done, Jeff brings out a pack of cigarettes to cool off, but Susan doesn't mind. Up next, Susan gets pregnant for Jeff even though she's on birth control pills. Susan swears to Jeff that she didn't get pregnant for him on purpose. Jeff is initially hesitant, but later agrees to take the baby because he loves Susan so much. He asks Susan to marry him, and she immediately agrees. Weeks later, the duo prepares to get married. On their lovely day, Jeff's father tells his son how proud he is because Jeff finally took the big step. On the other hand, Susan's friends praise Jeff's character in front of his mother and wish they had had another son besides Jeff. Minutes later, Susan is walked to the altar and the priest pronounces Jeff and Susan a couple. At the wedding reception, Jeff finds a private room and makes out with Susan. Back in the present day, the prosecutor asked Jeff's friend how the relationship between Susan and Jeff was. He says Susan is a quiet person, so he couldn't really get the read on her. Now in the flashback scene, Jeff and Susan welcome a baby boy, who they named Andrew. Their neighbor, Allie, congratulates the couple. Jeff informs Allie that he would like to hang out with Allie's husband later, but Allie says Jeff might not have that kind of time again, because he's now a father. Upon entering the house, Jeff asks when Susan will be ready for pleasure, and Susan says the doctor gave her 4 months. Jeff says he might not be able to hold out for that long, but Susan assures him that he can manage. It is revealed then that Jeff agreed to take the child because he wants the child to have a father. Later on, Jeff gets a job at a construction company, and Susan tells her friends that she hopes Jeff is successful. One night, Susan prepares a dinner party with her friends in honor of Jeff. However, Jeff is with his friends at a nightclub and forgets to make the party. Upon getting home, Susan quietly challenges Jeff about his whereabouts, but Jeff changes things up and starts screaming at Susan. Feeling remorseful, Jeff apologizes to Susan, and just then, Susan lets it out that she's pregnant again. Soon afterwards, the couple gives birth to another boy, named Cody. After Cody's birth, Jeff starts forcing himself on Susan, and she doesn't fight back because she wants peace. Sometime later at a family gathering, Jeff informs everybody that he's being prepped for a promotion at work. Susan then reveals that she is planning to return to school in order to finish her course as a nurse. Hearing this, Jeff feels hurt and betrayed. Upon getting home, Jeff screams at Susan and tells her that she is not allowed to return to school because it's her job to take care of the family. Later on, Susan discovers a pair of nunchucks under the bed. Jeff threatens to terminate her with it if she doesn't act according to his will. One day at the gym, Jeff's friend advises Jeff to sort out the mess in his home. Jeff arrives home and realizes that his wife and children are gone. He immediately knew that Susan would be at her mother's place. Jeff arrives when Susan's mother is busy advising her to file for divorce. Jeff manages to convince Susan that he still loves her very much, and Susan agrees to return home with him. The family returns home, and Jeff threatens Susan about leaving again. Later on, it is revealed that Jeff's and Susan's relationship is controlling. Susan is always scared to create a mess in the house because of what Jeff would do to her. Shortly afterward, Susan finds some unpaid bills and tries to confront Jeff about them, but he threatens her. Now in the courtroom, The prosecutor asked the judge to restrain Susan from crying because this might attract pity from the jury. Back to our interesting story. Susan is out shopping but realizes that her card has been declined. She manages to buy the things she could afford in cash because she's planning a surprise date night for her husband. That night, Jeff arrives home, but before entering the house, he takes a moment to ingest some hard substances. Jeff enters the house and starts having aggressive play with his son. This play later ends up with Andrew getting hurt, but Jeff doesn't seem to care. Susan tries to tell him that she's prepared a lot for him, but Jeff calls Susan all sorts of names and ignores her. He says he needs to sleep and leaves Susan embarrassed in the living room. That night, Susan gets mad and ties Jeff to the bedstand. She then brings out a knife and starts puncturing Jeff all over his body. Meanwhile, the prosecutor is also trying to recreate the crime scene in the courtroom. Susan narrates that while busy terminating Jeff, she heard Andrew knocking and had to stop. She shows Andrew to his room and promises that everything is okay. On her way back to the room, Susan picks up another knife and continues with her vicious act. Susan reveals that she was so scared of Jeff, and that is the reason she kept pushing the knife into his body. It is revealed that Susan created 193 holes in Jeff. Moments later, Susan drags Jeff's body outside the house and buries him in a shallow grave. After burying Jeff, Susan calls Jeff's mother and tells her that Jeff angrily left home. The following day, Susan goes to a store to buy potting soil. She then visits the bank and withdraws all the money in their joint account. Shortly afterward, Susan digs up the grave and fills it up with the potting soil she bought. She gradually starts cleaning the house. Jeff's friend calls to ask about him because he hasn't seen him at work. Susan then informs him that Jeff and she had a fight, which puts Jeff to leave without saying where he's going. Shortly afterward, Jeff's parents also call Susan to ask about Jeff. Susan says Jeff just left the house now after picking up some clothes. Up next, Susan goes to the police station to get a restraining order against Jeff. She tells the officer that her husband is trying to hurt her. Soon afterward, Susan had to confess to her mother what she did. Her mother immediately contacts a lawyer named Dean for help. Dean arrives at the house and discovers that Jeff's dog has dug up Jeff's body and is already tearing it apart. Dean immediately takes Susan to a psychiatric hospital. He instructs her not to talk to anyone except her. Afterward, Dean reports to the police about the crime. At the hospital, Susan is interviewed by the doctor and she seems very frightened. Elsewhere, the police are combing Susan's house for any evidence they can get. Jeff's parents also learned of their son's death on the TV. While the police arrive busy investigating, they discover that Susan filed for a restraining order. However, a CSI agent tells the detective that he doesn't see any defensive act from Jeff when he was being terminated. The police start going through Jeff's files, and they discover that he has an issue with substance use. At the hospital, the doctor evaluates Susan and informs Dean that she is suffering from PTSD. He also says Susan was in a dissociative state after she committed the crime, and she is not over it yet. Now at the coroner's lab, he informs the detective that Jeff died 2 days before Susan filed for a restraining order. The detective immediately realizes that Susan was only trying to cover her steps. She called for her immediate arrest and adds that she should be charged for Jeff's death. Later on, Susan is let out on bail after receiving reports from the hospital that she might be suffering from a psychotic breakdown. The news stations immediately tag Susan with a new name, Blue-Eyed Butcher. Jeff's parents are sad because Susan was let out on bail. Shortly afterward, Susan puts all her husband's belongings out for sale, and people troop in to bid for them. Dean arrives and scolds Susan for such an act. He says the jury pool would be monitoring everything she does and her latest act does not bode well for her. At Susan's trial, both the prosecutor and the defendant all try and put in their best to convince the jury and judge whether Susan is guilty or not. During the trial, the court learns that Jeff just got new life insurance, and the prosecutor believes Susan terminated Jeff because of money. As the trial proceeds, Dean has no choice but to put Susan on the witness list so she can have a chance of convincing the court. As the prosecutor shows her image of Jeff, Susan cries, but the prosecutor says she's only pretending. After hearing both sides, the jury decides to leave and come back with a verdict. Dean tells Susan that the longer the jury waits, the better it is. While waiting, Susan was informed that the jury has requested one more day to make their decision. The following day in the courtroom, the jury prepares to give their verdict. Surprisingly, the jury finds Susan guilty of terminating Jeff. Susan is then sentenced to 25 years imprisonment. While in prison, Susan receives a lawyer who says he can fight to get her out. The lawyer says he doesn't believe that Susan was tried fairly. As the movie comes to an end, it was revealed that Susan's sentence was reduced by 5 years after an appeal. She will then be eligible for parole in 2014. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to receive future recaps.